For decades, audiences believed the voyages of the Starship Enterprise were about unity, friendship, and courage. Yet, behind the polished episodes, tensions boiled, egos collided, and tempers sometimes pushed the cast to the breaking point. William Shatner, the man who brought Captain Kirk to life, was at the center of both the triumph and the turmoil. Now in his later years, he speaks with honesty about those days, revealing a truth far different from the heroic adventures that captured the world's imagination. A childhood marked by drama. William Shatner's life began in Montreal, Canada on March 22, 1931, in the middle of a record-breaking snowstorm. His mother had no choice but to give birth at home because the roads were blocked. From the very beginning, his story carried a sense of unpredictability and drama, almost as if fate was preparing him for a life on stage. By the age of 8, Shatner was already attending a children's acting school run by a respected Canadian actress. At just 10 years old, he was performing professionally in radio productions such as The Magic Flute for CBC. Soon after, he received praise for playing Tom Sawyer in a local stage production where critics marveled at his stage presence. Despite his early talent, Shatner's education was rocky. At McGill University in 1948, he studied economics, a practical choice to please his parents, but he never truly belonged in lecture halls. He admitted years later that he rarely attended classes, finding his real passion in the campus theater. By 1950, he had written and performed in a student play that became so popular it earned him attention from CBC producers. That was his first appearance on television, a small taste of the screen career ahead. In 1956, Shatner took his biggest gamble yet. He moved to New York City to chase acting full-time. His Broadway debut came with Tamburlaine the Great, which lasted only 20 performances. Though the show failed, the experience was pivotal. A young Canadian with no formal training had made it to the New York stage. From there, Shatner began building a resume on American television during the late 1950s and early 1960s. He appeared in series like Alfred Hitchcock Presents, The Defenders, and The Outer Limits. But it was his 2 appearances on The Twilight Zone, especially the 1963 episode Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, that showcased his ability to play characters unraveling under pressure. This knack for portraying tension and barely controlled panic would later become central to his most famous role, becoming Captain Kirk. By 1965, William Shatner was steadily working in television, but nothing suggested he was about to take on the role that would define his life. At that time, Star Trek already had a captain. Jeffrey Hunter played Christopher Pike in the original pilot titled The Cage. NBC executives, however, rejected it, claiming the show was too slow and cerebral. Instead of canceling the idea, they did something unusual. They ordered a second pilot. Hunter chose not to return, reportedly to focus on films, though Shatner later hinted there may have been deeper disagreements behind his departure. With the role suddenly vacant, producers turned to Shatner. He was shown the rejected pilot, and while he admired the production values, he thought the performances were far too stiff. He believed the captain needed a more relatable, lighter touch. When Shatner stepped in as James T. Kirk in 1966, he reimagined the character as both commanding and approachable. He wanted Kirk to be curious about the unknown, enthusiastic about exploration, yet relaxed enough to joke with his crew. Instead of barking rigid commands, Kirk could lean toward a helmsman and casually say, "Take us left, George." This sense of ease made him different from the typical military archetypes on television at the time. To shape Kirk's personality, Shatner drew on 2 inspirations. One was Horatio Hornblower, the naval hero known for intelligence and bravery. The other was Alexander the Great, a role Shatner himself had played in a failed 1963 TV pilot. He brought Alexander's mix of charisma and authority to Kirk. The addition of humor, something Shatner insisted on, further softened the edges. Unlike many science fiction heroes, Kirk wasn't just a cold strategist. He was someone viewers could laugh with and trust. The gamble paid off. When Star Trek premiered in September 1966, Kirk quickly became a standout. The character embodied courage and optimism during a turbulent decade, and audiences connected with his unwavering confidence. Yet, even as the show gained loyal fans, life behind the cameras was far from harmonious. For Shatner, stepping into command meant more than leading the fictional crew of the Enterprise. It also meant navigating real-world rivalries that threatened to tear the cast apart. Fights, feuds, and sabotage. While viewers saw teamwork on screen, the reality behind the Star Trek set was often chaotic. William Shatner's ambition, his constant rewrites, and his determination to dominate the spotlight created tension that sometimes erupted into open conflict. What fans never realized at the time was that the friendships portrayed on screen were strained by jealousy and resentment just a few feet away from the cameras. One early flashpoint came during the filming of The Man Trap in September 1966. Leonard Nimoy, whose character Spock was becoming unexpectedly popular, found himself at odds with Shatner. Believing Nimoy was stealing attention, Shatner deliberately walked into Nimoy's shots, not once but 17 times, forcing costly retakes. The director was furious, and Nimoy threatened to walk off the set if it continued. It was one of the first cracks in the illusion of unity. Clashes weren't limited to petty rivalries. In March 1968, while shooting The Paradise Syndrome, Shatner and Nimoy erupted into a heated argument over how Captain Kirk's amnesia should be portrayed. Shatner wanted drama and intensity, while Nimoy argued for subtlety. The standoff delayed production for hours until creator Gene Roddenberry intervened to calm both men. Writers were equally frustrated. During The Trouble with Tribbles in 1967, Shatner and Nimoy spent 14 straight hours rewriting dialogue, cutting other characters' lines in the process. By the third season, cast members half-jokingly referred to the program as the Shatner-Nimoy Show. Even groundbreaking moments were not free from tension. In 1968's Plato's Stepchildren, the script called for an interracial kiss between Shatner's Kirk and Nichelle Nichols' Uhura, a bold move for American television. Shatner reportedly worried about audience backlash and asked for an alternate version without the kiss. Nichols, however, believed in the scene's importance and worked with Shatner to sabotage every non-kiss take, forcing the studio to broadcast the historic moment. Beyond creative battles, the grueling schedule added fuel to the fire. Episodes sometimes required 16 to 22 hours of filming, leaving cast and crew exhausted. In October 1968, during the Tholian Web, Shatner himself broke down after 18 hours on set, throwing his script in frustration and refusing to continue until given rest. Even the captain of the Enterprise could not escape the crushing demands of the show. The price at home. While William Shatner commanded the bridge of the Enterprise with confidence, his private life was unraveling. The endless hours on set didn't just strain his body and his relationships with fellow actors. They tore into his family. Shatner's first marriage to Canadian actress Gloria Rand had begun in 1956 with hope and stability. Together they had 3 daughters, Leslie in 1958, Elizabeth in 1961, and Melanie in 1964. But by the late 1960s, the pressures of Star Trek left little room for fatherhood or marriage. The production schedule was merciless. Shatner would leave home before dawn for makeup and often return long after midnight. He later admitted that between 1966 and 1969, he missed 217 family dinners. On Christmas Day in 1967, while most families gathered around trees and gifts, he was on set, filming reshoots for the Gamesters of Tricelian. On April 12, 1968, he missed his daughter Elizabeth's school play because he was locked in yet another rewriting session with Leonard Nimoy. His absence became the rule, not the exception. Gloria's patience eroded with each missed milestone. Birthdays passed without him there. Holidays went uncelebrated, and even simple weekends together became impossible. Shatner himself admitted in a 2018 interview that the guilt of those years still weighs heavily on him. In June 1969, just weeks after Star Trek was canceled, Gloria filed for divorce. She cited his constant absences and emotional distance, explaining that it felt like she was raising their children alone. The timing was cruel. At the very moment his family collapsed, so too did his career. Shatner had sacrificed his home life for a role that no longer existed. Instead of returning to a stable household for comfort, he faced an empty home and 3 daughters living with their mother in Beverly Hills. His attempts to reconnect often fell short, and although he remained close to his children in later years, those lost weekends, 47 in total, he calculated, became painful reminders of the cost of fame. The man who had become a cultural symbol of leadership and strength was, in truth, a husband and father watching the most important parts of his life slip away. And as the cameras stopped rolling, the real struggle for survival was only beginning. From homelessness to revival. When Star Trek ended in 1969 after just 3 seasons, William Shatner's life collapsed almost overnight. The show had built a small but loyal following. Yet, it wasn't enough to keep it alive. And once it was canceled, Shatner faced a problem familiar to many actors: typecasting. He was no longer seen as a versatile performer. To casting agents, he was Captain Kirk and only Captain Kirk. In the early 1970s, jobs became scarce. The man once hailed as the next Marlon Brando was now reduced to taking whatever parts he could find, often in low-budget horror or exploitation films like Big Bad Mama, The Devil's Reign, and Kingdom of the Spiders. These roles didn't build his career. They only paid the bills, barely. With his daughters living with Gloria in Beverly Hills, Shatner was left struggling to make ends meet. At one point, he was so broke that he lived out of a camper parked in the San Fernando Valley. He later referred to this time simply as that period too painful to describe in detail. To scrape by, he would make appearances at small parties or minor events, even wrapping up old possessions like his Star Trek phaser to give as Christmas presents to his daughters because he couldn't afford new gifts. The humiliation of those years stayed with him for decades. Everything changed in 1977 when Star Wars exploded into theaters. Paramount realized it had its own space property waiting to be revived. By 1979, Star Trek, the motion picture, premiered with a $35 million budget, one of the most expensive films ever made at the time. At 48 years old, Shatner returned as Captain Kirk, thinner from losing 25 pounds through strict dieting, determined to reclaim his career. The film earned $139 million worldwide. Not a runaway hit, but enough to prove there was still life in the franchise. True redemption came with Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan in 1982. The leaner budget forced stronger storytelling, and Shatner's Kirk, now older and more vulnerable, resonated deeply. Critics praised his performance, and suddenly, the man who had been homeless just a few years earlier was back at the helm of a cultural juggernaut. Reflection, regret, and resilience. By the mid-1980s, William Shatner had rebuilt his reputation, not only through the Star Trek films, but also with a new television role in T.J. Hooker. As Sergeant Thomas Jefferson Hooker, he once again played a commanding figure, this time on the streets rather than in space. The series drew solid ratings and reminded audiences that Shatner could carry more than one role. Off-camera, he pushed himself relentlessly, often doing his own stunts. The physical demands left him with broken ribs, concussions, and the beginnings of chronic back pain that would haunt him into old age. Yet, even as he pushed forward, Star Trek remained both his salvation and his shadow. The cast's resentment never fully disappeared. George Takei, James Doohan, and others spoke publicly about Shatner's domineering behavior. While Shatner himself admitted that insecurity had fueled some of his choices, the tension between him and Leonard Nimoy remained complicated. They collaborated, argued, and sometimes stopped speaking altogether. By the time Nimoy died in 2015, the two were estranged, a loss Shatner described as one of the deepest regrets of his life. His later success on Boston Legal from 2004 to 2008 gave him a new identity outside science fiction. As Denny Crane, he blended comedy with tragedy, earning 2 Emmy Awards. But by then, the physical toll of his career was undeniable. Hearing loss from years on noisy sets, severe arthritis, and constant back pain became part of his daily reality. In interviews, He admitted that fear of loneliness, more than pain, was what weighed on him most. Now, in his 90s, Shatner has spoken with rare honesty about what really happened on the Star Trek set. He acknowledges the sabotage, the fights, and the ego battles, admitting they came from his own drive to stay in the spotlight. "I failed sometimes," he said plainly, "but I was always trying to keep the show alive." The fearless Captain Kirk, who once represented the best of humanity, was behind the camera as a man struggling to balance ambition, insecurity, and the crushing demands of fame. It is this complexity, the hero on screen, the flawed human off it, that has finally been revealed. William Shatner's journey proves that even legends carry scars. The man who embodied courage and leadership was also vulnerable to fear, rivalry, and regret. Now at 93, his candor allows fans to see not just Captain Kirk, but the man behind the uniform, a man who paid a heavy price for the role that defined him. Do you think William Shatner was unfairly judged by his castmates? Or did his ambition truly make him the villain of the Star Trek set? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories about the untold struggles of Hollywood icons.